This was the scene of Manhattan in the early 20th century. Through the hustle and bustle of the island lies one of the main ways of travel, elevated trains. These elevated trains dominated the landscape, serving hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers daily. Except people hated them, which is why by 1955, almost all of them were gone in Manhattan.
The L's were not popular. I mean, we kind of look back with rose-colored glasses of like, oh, the old New York, it was so pretty and this. It's like, it wasn't. Like, there's a reason people like hated these things. And the second that subways proved to be a viable technology, people were calling for their removal.
Even though the outer boroughs of the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens still retained some elevated lines, large portions of their elevated network was removed. And that becomes ever more apparent when you take a train through either East New York or Queensboro Plaza, where you see old platforms and trackways abandoned as the elevated lines that once served them were demolished. However, there seems to be a reversal in that ideology. Many New York City elevated trains, like the 7, are cultural icons. New elevated train lines, like the Interborough Express, are getting the green light, while elevated train proposals, like Queens Link, are extremely popular. So why are attitudes shifting about the L's? And what does that tell us about the state of city planning in New York City? This is why New York City is building elevated trains again. So to understand why New York City is building elevated trains, we must dive into the history of the L's. In New York City, there are two distinct periods of when elevateds were built. The one from the 1870s and 80s, and the one from the dual contract era.
You've got the post-Civil War, so basically from, I think it was 69 was the very first one, but mostly in the 1870s and 1880s, up until 1900. Those L's were not modern, let's call it that way.
This is Andrew Lynch. Otherwise known as Van Schickenragen, he has been blogging about the New York City subway and the Boston T for about 20 years, perfecting the track maps you use daily. He is currently the Chief Design Officer of Queens Link, an organization that advocates to turn the abandoned Rockaway Beach branch into a subway line. More about that later.
There are these wooden station houses with little coal furnaces. The trains were a lot shorter. There were more station stops. They were very inefficient in terms of their interlocking. The trains themselves were basically glorified streetcars. They were made of wood. They were light. There was also a power difference. That's something that people don't realize. There were so a lot of elevated lines would have two third rails. One for the elevated, one for the L's, this is getting confusing, and then one for the subway trains.
But there was a major problem with elevated trains: noise. You see, elevated trains we know and love are built on steel structures. Steel is pretty flexible, so when a train runs over it, the steel shakes so much that it amplifies the noise. And it also doesn't help that the bottom of the tracks aren't covered. I mean, it is great that sunlight gets filtered onto the street, but not so much for blocking noise from the train above. But for 40 years, New Yorkers put up with the elevateds. Despite the noise and the fact that it was ugly, without the elevateds, there was no way New Yorkers could get around. But when the first subway opened, it proved to be a major hit. It was clean, fast, but most importantly was invisible. The rumble of trains has been moved underground, and that was the real nail in the coffin for elevateds. Because of its success, people now wanted all elevated train lines to be replaced with a subway. That posed a problem with future attempts to expand the subways. For example, the dual contracts, a series of massive subway extensions to support a growing New York City. But the private companies resisted subway expansion by only using subways because they're expensive, and they were footing part of the bill. So a compromise was granted. Build subways in the core of the city, build elevateds in the outer boroughs, where there are fewer people living there. Pretty simple politics, if you ask me. But there was a difference to these dual contract Ls.
When technology advanced and the city realized that it needed larger cars, longer train sets, steel became more affordable to build cars out of, at first just parts and eventually the whole thing. Well, steel trains are heavier, right? And so because of that, they needed stronger elevated structures. And so the second wave of L building came part of the first subway in 1904 that was extended up to the Bronx, and then more so during the dual contract, which is where you get all the elevated lines down in South Brooklyn, the Astoria line, the Flushing line, that type of thing. And these were built to much higher standards.
But there was resistance to the new elevateds, despite them being built to much higher standards. The L train was supposed to be elevated past Montrose Avenue, using the old Evergreen branch right-of-way. But Bushwick residents fought against it, which is why the L remains in a tunnel all the way to Wilson Avenue, or Broadway Junction, depending on which direction you're taking it. The G train, initially proposed by the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, or BRT, was supposed to be an elevated line. In fact, Queensboro Plaza had provisions for it. But because it went through built-up areas of Greenpoint and Williamsburg, residents fiercely opposed it. It was later axed from the dual contracts. The successor to the BRT, the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Corporation, or BMT, proposed it in the 1920s, but it was struck down again because of its elevated nature. Even our very own iconic 7 train was not immune to these protests. The 7 was supposed to be elevated through Flushing, but Flushing opposed the elevated, so the line was buried into a tunnel. This is why Flushing Main Street Station is the odd one out, where it was the only underground 3-track station on the 7. However, most of the elevateds proposed in the dual contracts were built, and today, almost all of New York City's remaining elevated lines were built during this era. But during this time, the private companies were struggling. For one, inflation was slowly eroding the value of the nickel. But what really dialed up their problems to an 11 is that John Francis Hylan was just elected mayor of New York City.
As the story goes, when he was a law student, he was working nights driving elevated trains in Brooklyn, and supposedly took a curve too quick and almost hit sort of a supervisor, and they fired him on the spot. And the myth is that he sort of held that grudge until he became, the mayor.
However, let's not forget that Hylan was the only person that hated the private companies. After all, there was a movement to bury the L's into a subway, but the private companies refused to do so. So it created the perfect storm for Hylan to form a municipal subway to do exactly just that. So with the backing from officials and the public, Hylan unveiled the IND in 1922. It was supposed to be this grand subway system, meant to replace the dirty old elevator lines. Instead of accurate junctions, they used flying junctions for added efficiency. Instead of tiny cramped stations, they invested extra for massive mezzanines. But the most important of all, the IND was Old Subway. Well, except for a notable area. This is Smith 9th Street on the F and G, the tallest station in the world. Well, not anymore, but as you can see, This station and the next station down, 4th Avenue, 9th Street, is built very differently than the old L's. Instead of using steel, they used concrete. Now, why is that? Well, concrete isn't as flexible as steel and is extremely thick and heavy. This means that if a train runs over it, concrete will dampen the noise of the elevated. Want proof? And also, concrete viaducts was, and still is, considered the modern way. On some dual contract stations, whenever an L goes over a parkway, the L is made out of concrete. Think the 7 train on Queens Boulevard. The IND pretty much took this idea and ran with it. But even so, the IND envisioned that most of what they are building would be a subway. Even when they were building through Queens farmland, the IND still insisted that its main Queens line would be entirely underground. Again, they needed to attract as many people as possible, and L's were not the way to do that.
So the IND went on to pick up a lot of the plans that had been in the works at the time, an 8th Avenue trunk line, a crosstown line between Brooklyn and Queens. And then they also looked around and said, okay, what do we want this subway to be for the future? And that's where they added the line under 6th Avenue. That's where they started adding lines to Queens. And they realized there were issues at the DeKalb on the BMT. And so that's why they thought, all right, let's build a line to Coney Island. So all these things started to coalesce over the next few years in terms of planning, and then they started building.
But Highland made enemies within Tammany Hall. Combined with an investigation appointed by then-Governor Al Smith that condemned his handling of the subways, Highland was voted out in 1925. However, his successor, James Walker, pretty much followed all of Highland's policies, even though privately he thought of Highland as a fool. So, continue the IND? Check. Keep the 5-cent fare? Check. And take the IRT to court when the IRT wanted to raise the fare to 7 cents? What do you think? That case, Gilchrist v. IRT, made it up to the Supreme Court. Despite a very business-friendly court at the time, they ruled in favor of Walker, and the 5-cent fare mandate was reinstated. That pretty much sealed the fate of the IRT and BMT. Combined with the Great Depression, which saw ridership decrease, the IRT went into receivership in 1931. While the IND was built out during the Great Depression thanks to the New Deal, the IRT and BMT were not given the same treatment. So after years of fighting, they threw in the towel. On June 12, 1940, the IRT and BMT leases to operate the New York City subway were terminated. Now everything is the IND. And with complete control of the entire system, New York City started to demolish all of the redundant elevated lines. In 1940, there were about 136 miles of elevated lines. By the end of the decade, the number was down to 106, a more than 20% decrease. And by 1955, the last remaining 1870s L was removed in Manhattan, the 3rd Avenue L.
But the old steel skeleton outlived its usefulness. Passengers dwindled, and so the L is being torn down.
Now, this isn't to say that planners fully shunned any idea of trains going above the surface. During this time, planners saw an opportunity to buy 2 railroad lines, the New York, Westchester, and Boston Railway, and the LIRR Rockaway branches. Both of them were elevateds. You may know them as the Dyer branch of the 5 train and the Rockaway branch of the A train, respectively. And the 1968 Program for Action called for some elevateds to be built next to railroad rights-of-way. And that was the fundamental difference between what was proposed and what was torn down. Planners tore down the old and replaced it with what they thought was the new hot thing. Pretty radical idea, I know. So in the 50s, it was expressways or subways. Or if you're in Chicago, do both. If planners had to build elevateds, they would do it the modern way, like the Rockaway extension of the A. Despite it being built in 1942 as part of an LIRR grade separation project, it was built on a modern concrete viaduct, minimizing noise. These new elevateds were nothing like the old elevateds, where they were old, noisy, and falling apart.
Was it short-sighted to demolish the 3rd Avenue L before 2nd Avenue? We can say that in hindsight, yes, but I also think that the transit authority at the time, and then the MTA, once the MTA was created, would have eventually made that decision anyway, because they never had the money to invest in what it would have taken to basically bring it up to modern standards. These things are beyond antiquated. Like the trains that we have for them have to be specialized. We don't have the money to even maintain the structures. And if we wanted to make that investment, we'd have to buy a whole new train set just for that line, as opposed to being able to just move trains around in our existing system.
This is why the removal of the elevateds continued well after the 50s. In 1969, the southern half of the Myrtle Avenue L closed. In 1973, the final part of the 3rd Avenue L closed. In 1975, the Culver Shuttle was closed. And in 1977, the Jamaica portion of the BMT Jamaica L, ironic, was closed. But then, something else happened. By the late 70s, the system was in a complete freefall. There was high crime and trains were delayed. What was a 10-minute trip in 1910 took 40 minutes in 1980, thanks to systemic deferred maintenance. That ambitious program for action gutted, in favor of barely keeping the trains running. Because of increasing public pressure, priority shifted towards fixing the system.
This system has changed a lot within the last 10 years. We do our job, we bust our butt every day. What does it mean? A safer railroad, a smoother riding railroad?
And that included the elevator lines, which ended up being a great decision.
The first capital plan wasn't created until like 1981, and it took a lot of work by Richard Ravitch to rally both local politicians and local businesses, like big businesses, like banks. And he would bring them down to the subway and be like, look how bad it is. Like, it's so much worse than you think. We need dedicated funding. We need a dedicated capital plan so we, can start working on these projects. I think the shift back towards L's, there might be a little bit of a nostalgia factor to it. A lot of it was just plain, hey, we need this transit, and we're not getting the subway anytime soon, so we may as well fix what we have.
However, it was not all sunshine and rainbows. In 1986, the MTA announced that it was studying shutting down dozens of elevated lines. Although it was more of a scare tactic to get more money, some of the service cuts seemed to feel a little more grounded in reality. The Franklin Avenue Shuttle. The Franklin Avenue Shuttle is a half-elevated, half-open cut line in central Brooklyn. It used to be a crucial part of the BMT elevated network, as it connected the Brighton line to the BMT Fulton Street L. But when the St. Felix Street connection opened in 1920, which opened a direct route to Midtown Manhattan, that old connection became less useful. By 1940, when the Fulton Street L was torn down, that Franklin Avenue connection was reduced to an awkward stub terminal. That long decline continued. As time marched on, Franklin Avenue through service to Brighton ended in 1963. The line faced a derailment in 1974, and a station was closed in 1995. Nicknamed the Ghost Train because of its deteriorating conditions, the MTA wanted to close the shuttle to save money. But here's where things changed. While prior generations of New Yorkers would have lobbied for these elevated trains to be shut down, the newer generations of New Yorkers didn't. In fact, they lobbied against shutting down the shuttle.
There was a shift, and I think that shift came as part of a greater shift focused back towards cities. It was sort of that first wave of gentrification where you had a lot of young professionals that didn't want to move to the suburbs. And they were finding these old neighborhoods, brownstone neighborhoods, and realizing these are really nice. And I don't have to have a car and I can get around. And there was that. And then you also had a lot of awareness in minority communities in the center cities that absolutely relied on mass transit, right? So it was this perfect storm of people coming back to the city and realizing this is a place that needs investment.
In the end, the protesters won. The MTA decided to renovate the shuttle. Today, the shuttle comes on time 99% of the time and sees 20,000 riders daily. Not a bad improvement considering where it was in the 70s. And this became a new phenomenon, where local residents often banded together to stop the L's from falling down. It was a nuisance for sure, but without the L's, the neighborhood was nothing. Coming into the new millennium, Now that the subways were in better shape, attention turned to building new train lines. One of them was the JFK AirTrain, a proposed 8.1-mile elevated train line that would connect the subway to the airport. And very quickly, protests emerged against building the L, though this time there was more of a split. There were proponents of the line, including then Congressman Floyd Flake, and different community board members. On the other side were the civic groups in Jamaica. After all, they fought a long battle 2 decades ago to remove an elevated line, the BMT Jamaica L. Now, they viewed the new elevated line as a repeat of what they went through. But because this new line went over the expressway, that argument of noise and decreasing property values didn't hold. Also, this new elevated line would use the latest technology, like concrete viaducts and continuously welded rail, to reduce noise. Finally, the AirTrain would decrease traffic on the Van Wyck Expressway, which would benefit people living near it. So in the end, the JFK AirTrain was built and opened in 2003. But again, there were failures. The JFK AirTrain was supposed to extend further north to LaGuardia Airport, then to Midtown Manhattan. But partly because of its elevated nature, the plan was shot down. Later, in 1998, there were plans to extend the Astoria line to LaGuardia Airport. But again, because of its elevated nature, that was also shot down by local politicians. But despite these failures, public opinion continued to shift on elevated trains. What were once neighborhoods fiercely opposed to any new elevated, or in general, any new rail, are suddenly now champions of it. In 2022, Governor Kathy Hochul announced the IBX, a 14-mile elevated and open-cut train line that would connect Brooklyn and Queens without going to Manhattan. And if you looked at where the line would go, it was in central Queens, one of the most NIMBYest neighborhoods out in the city. When the IBX was first announced, there was opposition towards it. Residents feared that it would be another one of those freight trains that is extremely loud and blow trash into their backyards. But as the feasibility and environmental studies progressed, those concerns slowly went away. The opposition only returned when the MTA proposed to street run those trains. However, while the community, and literally everyone else, protested street running, this protest was different. Instead of protesting against the line, they were protesting to make it better. So, what exactly happened? Turns out that the MTA has been vigorously conducting outreach. They held multiple open houses, took questions from residents, and informed residents that the IBX trains that they want to use are not the same as freight trains. And they took some criticism, agreeing to remove street running on the IBX. And this has shown that the antidote to NIMBYism is communication.
You would have to have those people from the beginning to feel like they're part of the project, as opposed to coming in later after the fact and say, hey, we're going to ram this down your throat.
And that is something that the MTA has done really well, and public opinion has shifted to reflect that. This public opinion shift also has affected other projects. Take Queenslink. You see, the Rockaway Beach branch needs elevated portions, and Queenslink has not run away from that topic, and in fact, openly embraced the elevated portions in the numerous renderings that they did.
One of the first things I did when I got involved with the Queens Link, and it was Queens Rail back then, was to look at sort of the history of the project, because I wanted to understand, the NIMBY factor. Like, yes, people were saying to me, oh yeah, they tried it in the 70s and people fought it. So I did the research, and what I found was, yeah, people were up in arms against the destruction of Forest Park. And they were mad that this train line, which had served their neighborhoods, was no longer going to be serving neighborhoods, and they were going to be losing out at the expense of tourists, right? And if we develop the project as a local improvement, we're going to get all these people on board. And that's exactly what's happened. People are like, oh yes, this is a train line that if it was activated would take me directly to where I want to be and save me a lot of time. Like, everybody wants that.
Even though Queensway painted Queenslink as this thunderous, ugly elevated rail, local residents still back Queenslink by a massive margin, at 75%. The reactivation of this train line has the support of conservative Republicans, centrists, progressives, and democratic socialists. And I think there's a tide turning in New York City. For the longest time, New Yorkers have been against elevated trains. But now, with ways to make elevated trains quiet, New Yorkers are now starting to wake up to the fact that the elevated trains of yesterday are not the elevated trains of today. And we like to see that. as elevated trains are an amazing addition to any city. They provide views like no other, are easy to construct, and if built correctly, can feature park space and blend into the landscape. If Vancouver can do it, if Miami can do it, then we, New York City, could do it.
There's always going to be, loud voices that don't want change. You have to accept it, but you can't let those minority voices get in the way. At the same time, you do have to listen to the community and understand things. So that's where I think we've succeeded, is getting people to understand it's not elevated versus subway. It's how do we create a project that helps the most people.
Hi, and thank you so much for watching this video. I also want to thank Van Stuckenragen for agreeing to do this interview. If you like this video, consider liking and subscribing. And yeah, that is pretty much all. See you in the next video.